There is a verse in the New Testament that mentions two names never found anywhere in the Old Testament, two men who stood face to face against Moses, names the Hebrew Bible chose never to record. Their names were Jannes and Jambres, and according to Jewish and Christian tradition, they were the court magicians of the Pharaoh of Egypt, the men Pharaoh summoned when Moses and Aaron demanded the release of Israel. The book of Exodus says that when Aaron threw down his staff and it became a serpent, Pharaoh called for his wise men, sorcerers and magicians, who did the same thing with their secret arts. Their staffs also became serpents, imitating God's miracle with a power the text never fully explains, leaving open the question of what force these men were actually invoking. But Aaron's serpent swallowed up the other serpents, the first sign that God's power was superior to anything these men could ever hope to imitate. Exodus does not give their names at this point, calling them simply the magicians of Egypt, men skilled in hidden arts who served directly at Pharaoh's court. It is over 1,000 years later in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, mentions their names directly for the first and only time in all of Scripture. Paul writes that just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, false teachers of the last days will also oppose the truth, men corrupt in mind and rejected in the faith. How did Paul know these names if the Old Testament never mentions them? The most accepted answer is that extra-biblical Jewish traditions preserved this information orally for generations. Ancient Jewish texts, like the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, identified Jannes and Jambres as sons of Balaam, the pagan prophet who later tried to curse Israel in the wilderness. Other traditions describe them as the very same magicians who later joined the Israelites when they left Egypt, part of the mixed multitude mentioned in the book of Exodus. This is fascinating because it suggests these Egyptian sorcerers, direct witnesses of God's power during the plagues, ended up joining the very people they had once tried to stop with magic. If this is true, Jannes and Jambres personally witnessed the 10 plagues of Egypt, the most devastating display of divine power ever recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. The first 2 plagues, turning water to blood and bringing a plague of frogs, the magicians managed to imitate with their secret arts, apparently matching the power of Moses and Aaron. But by the 3rd plague, the plague of gnats or lice, something changed. The magicians could no longer replicate the miracle, no matter how hard they tried with their usual techniques. It was then that the Egyptian magicians said the words to Pharaoh that would become one of the most revealing confessions in the entire book of Exodus. They said, "This is the finger of God," openly admitting that what they were witnessing completely surpassed any human or magical power they could control. From that moment on, the biblical text stops mentioning the Egyptian magicians actively intervening, as if their power had been completely exhausted by the escalation of divine power. Pharaoh, however, continued hardening his heart, ignoring even his own sorcerer's confession that they were facing something no human being could imitate or contain. The plagues that followed, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn, fell upon Egypt without the magicians appearing again to try to counter them. Their silence for the rest of the account is just as significant as their initial appearance. 2 men who began by challenging God and ended up disappearing entirely from the central narrative. This narrative disappearance is part of what makes their story so intriguing, suggesting they were marked, humbled, or perhaps convinced by what they witnessed. Later, Jewish tradition developed this story further, claiming Jannes and Jambres not only witnessed the plagues, but later took part in making the golden calf. According to these extra-biblical traditions, when Israel grew impatient, waiting for Moses on Mount Sinai, it was precisely these 2 former sorcerers who led the idolatry of the golden calf. If this tradition is correct, the same men who acknowledged the finger of God in Egypt would have later returned to the very practices that had defined them as pagan magicians. This raises a deeply human question. Is it possible to witness an undeniable miracle and still, over time, return to old habits once the pressure of the moment fades away? The Jewish Talmud and other later rabbinic commentaries expand their story even further, presenting them as sorcerers of great power who eventually met a tragic end for opposing God. Some traditions claim Jannes and Jambres drowned in the Red Sea along with Pharaoh's army when the waters returned to their natural course over the Egyptians. Other versions suggest they survived that moment, but were eventually executed by the people of Israel themselves after being discovered as instigators of the golden calf sin. The inconsistency between these traditions shows just how much ancient rabbis and writers tried to fill the gaps the original biblical text had deliberately left open. Outside the Bible, there also existed apocryphal texts specifically dedicated to them, including a lost document known as the Book of Jannes and Jambres, mentioned by early church writers. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential church fathers of the 3rd century, directly references this apocryphal book while commenting on Paul's letter to Timothy. This lost book, according to surviving fragments, described in great detail the life, magic, and final death of these two brothers, though the church never considered it inspired scripture. The existence of this apocryphal text shows just how much curiosity the story of Jannes and Jambres generated in the ancient world, enough that early Christians felt compelled to expand it in writing. Why did the Old Testament omit their names if they were clearly known in Jewish oral tradition centuries before Paul mentioned them in his letter to Timothy? Some scholars suggest the Book of Exodus deliberately avoided naming them so as not to give them any form of recognition or legitimacy, treating them simply as the magicians without their own identity. This theory fits a broader pattern in Hebrew scripture, where enemies of God are frequently stripped of their names as a way of denying them honor or memory. Other scholars believe their names simply were not part of the original written sources of Exodus, and that they emerged later as part of a parallel oral tradition that developed over time. Whatever the reason, the fact that Paul mentions them so naturally in the New Testament suggests that, for 1st century Jews, these names were widely known and accepted as historical. Paul does not stop to explain who they were, simply assuming that Timothy and the earliest Christian readers raised in Jewish tradition would know exactly who he meant. This is similar to how we mention certain historical names today without needing to explain who they were, relying on shared cultural knowledge everyone simply took for granted. Paul's mention also serves a clear theological purpose, warning the early church that the false teachers of their time would act just as these ancient Egyptian magicians acted against Moses. Paul writes that these false teachers will not get very far because their folly, like that of Jannes and Jambres, will become clear to everyone in time, no matter how much they try to deceive. This comparison directly connects the past to the present of the early Christians, using an ancient and well-known story to illustrate a spiritual danger that was fully current for them. What's fascinating is that this brief mention in a pastoral letter is the only reason we know these names at all. Without it, Jannes and Jambres would have remained anonymous forever. Their story also appears briefly reflected in texts from Qumran, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, where some fragments reference those who opposed Moses under similar names. This confirms that the tradition about these two magicians was far more widespread and established in Second Temple Judaism than the Old Testament's silence would suggest at first glance. Egyptian archaeology, for its part, has revealed that Pharaoh's court did in fact employ specialized ritual magic priests known as Heb trained in magical formulas and secret rituals. These real Egyptian priests used ceremonial staffs, incantations, and rituals that, according to discovered Egyptian texts, could produce effects their contemporaries considered truly supernatural. This gives the biblical account credible historical context. It was not far-fetched that Pharaoh had immediate access to men capable of imitating, at least partially, signs that appeared miraculous. The crucial difference, according to the biblical account, is that these magicians' power had a clear limit, while the power of God through Moses knew no boundary or resistance whatsoever. That limit became evident exactly at the moment of the third plague, when the magician's own confession marked the point where human imitation was completely surpassed. The phrase, "finger of God," they spoke, became, over the centuries, an expression used to describe any manifestation of divine power that no human being could replicate or explain. It is curious to think that these two men, who began the story as active adversaries of God, ended up, without meaning to, becoming unwilling witnesses who confirmed with their own words the authenticity of the miracle. Later, Christian tradition used their story as a constant warning against false spirituality, the empty imitation of true power, and the dangerous illusion of equating the divine with human tricks. In medieval Christian art and literature, Jannes and Jambres occasionally appear represented as archetypes of false wisdom, figures used to teach about the danger of spiritual pride. Some medieval writers even symbolically connected them to later figures of false prophets and antichrists, extending their meaning far beyond the original context of Exodus. This constant reuse of their story across so many centuries and different traditions shows the narrative power that even the briefest and least developed biblical characters can hold. Returning to the original text, the book of Exodus never explicitly says how many magicians there were, though tradition assumed Jannes and Jambres were the two main leaders among many wise men at court. This suggests there may have been other unnamed Egyptian magicians, whose identity was completely lost, while only these two survived in Jewish collective memory for reasons we can no longer fully reconstruct. Were they the most powerful, the most defiant, or simply the ones tradition chose to remember for some reason time has completely erased from the written record? What we do know for certain is that their story survived thanks to a single sentence from Paul, written almost 1,500 years after the events they supposedly took part in Egypt. Without that letter to Timothy, no modern Christian would have any idea that the nameless magicians of Exodus once had proper names, quietly preserved by Jewish oral tradition. This reminds us that the Bible, though it seems complete, is actually the tip of a much larger iceberg of traditions, stories, and details the original authors deliberately chose to leave out. Jannes and Jambres represent, perhaps better than any other case, the enormous gap between what Scripture officially records and what the community of faith remembered and passed down between generations. Their story raises another uncomfortable question. How many other biblical characters exist like this, mentioned in passing, with an entire life and tradition behind them that the Bible chose never to develop? Paul's letter to Timothy was probably written between 63 and 67 AD, near the end of his life, while he faced imprisonment and growing opposition from false teachers. In that context of crisis, Paul deliberately chooses a historical reference his Jewish readers would instantly recognize, reinforcing his warning with the weight of an already established and respected tradition. This shows that for early Christians, the story of Jannes and Jambres was not a marginal curiosity, but a cultural reference as solid as any other story from the Old Testament. Today, however, their names have been almost completely forgotten outside specialized academic and theological circles, despite having been so important in ancient Jewish and Christian memory. Their story invites us to wonder how many other pieces of the original oral tradition were completely lost over time, leaving only scattered fragments like the one Paul chose to preserve in writing. Every time someone reads Paul's letter to Timothy today, they likely pass over this mention without realizing they are touching one of the oldest and least explained mysteries in the entire Bible. Jannes and Jambres remain to this day two names suspended between history and legend, present in Scripture, yet completely absent from the original account where they supposedly acted. Their story ends where it began, in silence. Two magicians who defied God, witnessed his power, confessed their defeat, and then disappeared forever from the pages of the Hebrew Bible. And yet, thanks to a single sentence written centuries later, their names survived where so many other details of Exodus were completely lost in the silence of time.